The journey to net zero has started. Large companies are already required to report their energy saving strategies to government. It's only a matter of time before SMEs have to do the same. How ready are you for net zero? What needs to happen for our economy to make this promising and yet massively expensive transition? Is our energy infrastructure fit for purpose? Will we be able to continue making the steel that our industry needs? And can we and should we be protecting ourselves from carbon-intense overseas competition through the use of carbon taxes? Well, with me to examine these issues is Professor David Bailey from the Birmingham Business School at Birmingham University. He's also a senior fellow at UK Interchanging Europe. David, if you were asked to award marks to the UK economy for its readiness for net zero, how many marks would you give it?
So on the positive side, the UK really started to reduce the amount of carbon that's used in energy generation. It's done better than some other countries. So we've stopped burning so much coal, for example, and we've seen a big growth, for example, in offshore wind. So that's been a success story, but we need to go much further on that. And we really need to decarbonise how we travel, how we heat our homes, and also how we do manufacturing. So we've made a start, but I give it 3 or 4 out of 10, and there's a long way to go.
Well, that's not exactly a huge vote of confidence. In terms of manufacturing specifically, Make UK ran a survey and a report last year that found that 46% of firms have started to decarbonise, 25% are determined to do so in the next 12 months, and a further 17% over the next 24 months. And some are just racing ahead. Let's hear from a manufacturer who buys 100% into decarbonising her business.
So about 2 years ago, 18 months ago, we were talking about how we can reduce our carbon footprint. For context, I've got about 10 years left and then I'll be retiring off into the sunset. And I'm determined to have like a net zero factory by the time I retire. So I'd already put a timeline in. And I thought, right, I can't do that until I know where I'm starting from. I need a baseline to measure. So I sort of was on the internet, I was looking for carbon calculators, and there are several generic ones out there that have absolutely no bearing on anyone in manufacturing. So we couldn't measure it. So we didn't know where we were starting from. So same as anything else, you can't get to the end of the line until you know where you're starting from. So that's what we needed to do first. So we had Chris and some other researchers from Ateta at Birmingham University spend several days with us with a variety of different energy monitors that were linked up to software that they were writing as they went along. And they were measuring each aspect of the machine that produced carbon, that ran from energy, whether it was a motor here or motor there. And so it took a while to gather all that data, and then the theoretical calculations began.
David, that's a big shout out to your colleagues at Birmingham University there. We're going to be hearing from the Warwick Manufacturing Group shortly about their net zero engagement programme aimed specifically at SMEs. But it does sound like Birmingham, in common with a lot of academic centres, are taking this role of help and facilitation for companies seriously.
Absolutely, and we've seen a lot of work done at the University of Birmingham, but other, I think Midlands universities in particular, Aston, at Warwick, at Coventry, those universities really engage with companies. They're helping them in terms of Industry 4.0, but particularly in terms of the net zero journey. And any companies watching this video, I'd say, look, if you need help going forwards, do get in touch with your local universities and see if you can work with them.
Well, that's great advice. Let's continue with Kirsty Davies-Chinook for a moment, because what I found interesting is that the research team discovered that the biggest savings at her company were not where they thought they'd be.
What's come out of the study initially, it means we can tell you that if you have a 2 metre, 1 metre, 1.5 mil thick stainless steel sheet polished, It's going to take about 57 grams of CO2 to do that. The really interesting thing is that 3/4 of that CO2 produced is nothing to do with the polishing machine. It's actually to do with the extraction equipment that the polishing line is hooked up to that removes the dust. So we now need to move into talking to extraction companies to find out better ways and new ways of using extractors, because obviously they're lifting air and air's heavy, and that takes a lot of use of motors. So it's not a short race to the finish line. It's something that's going to be ongoing and embedded into everything we do, and it has definitely is going to improve energy efficiencies and save energy going forwards. But there's still a lot of work to get there.
You know, that's very reminiscent of a story that Alan Norbury, the chief technologist at Siemens, told me. He does a lot of factory visits. He said there was one factory he went into where it was very obvious that a lot of the energy savings could be made from secondary processes, not from the main primary manufacturing production line. He talked about an air vent that was open all the time when it didn't need to be. And so much energy could be saved just by introducing a sensor and a variable speed drive or something like that, just so that it would be shut when it wasn't needed and thereby save a huge amount of energy. Now, before we move on from Kirsty Davies-Chinnock, there's one standout feature about the carbon calculator that she and David's colleagues at Birmingham University put together. I asked her if she was going to use it exclusively to create a competitive advantage, to sell her company's services as being more green than her competitors.
I thought long and hard about this. We work predominantly in the stainless steel industry, and stainless steel is itself, as much as a mined mineral-based metal can be, very sustainable. We don't have end-of-life numbers on stainless steel because stainless steel that was installed in the 1920s is still going strong. So when you're working predominantly with material that is already sustainable, surely making it even more sustainable and giving people best practice to work to is a good thing. We're all on this planet together. We're all suffering climate change together. Some countries and some areas of the UK more so than others. For me to deny those advances and best practices, whilst it does have some elements of giving me a competitive advantage, in the long scheme of things, it's not making the industry itself work better, and we need to work together. We have to do that to make sure not only our industry survive, but in some cases that the areas of the UK are livable when you talk about flooding, and in other countries in the world that people are losing their lives due to climate change. For me to quite make a quick buck off the back of that leaves a very nasty taste in my mouth.
That was a lovely story, and it shows how many manufacturing firms, they have this process of continual improvement, and they're having to extend that now to get into as well how they start thinking about carbon. And remember that with all sorts of changes that are coming down the line, including possibly a carbon border adjustment mechanism coming out of the EU, companies are going to have to start counting carbon going forwards. And that video just then was a brilliant clip of how companies can start to do that, understand where they are, and then improve on it.
As you say, David, a very optimistic story from Kirsty, and of course the fact that she's sharing it with the rest of her competition, the spirit of collaboration in UK manufacturing exemplified right there. Now, I don't want us to get too optimistic about this, because I want to refer back to that Make UK report I mentioned earlier, because things are changing. I just want to recap the stats, because the report was taken in July 2022, 46% of manufacturers are on the journey, 25% over the next 12 months, 17% in the next 24 months. But times are changing and situations change very quickly. Things have become much harder and SME priorities are beginning to shift. Dr. Mark Swift and the Warwick Manufacturing Group run a program called Net Zero Innovation Network to help SMEs on their net zero journey. They're finding the picture is deteriorating.
I think the fundamental challenge at the moment is it's not on their radar. In fact, it's less on their radar than it was probably 6 months or certainly a year ago. And that's because the pressures of businesses are dominating. The pressures of manufacturing sector is really dominating at the moment, whether that's the skills, shortage of skills and skills availability, actually, whether it's general input costs, materials and energy, whether it's future order book and concerns about a recession. Net zero is really slipped down the agenda over the last few months or so. So what we would have to start, if we're having that conversation with business, we really understand what their key challenges are, some of the ones we've just mentioned. And if there is an element of decarbonisation we can bring into that business, we will look at it. So, for example, input costs, as I say, energy is a significant part of your input costs at the moment. We know what's been going on in the war in Ukraine and what the impacts that's had on energy prices, etc. Energy is directly related to carbon. So if you can reduce your energy costs, you can reduce your energy consumption, reduce your costs, you can reduce carbon. So starting from a cost point of view, through a better monitoring and control and management, you can actually reduce your carbon. Then once you start to reduce your costs, of course, you need to think about how you can then reinvest that into the business. There's other angles, of course, you could take, and we often do take with businesses. One of the drivers we're seeing for businesses who really are going down the path of decarbonisation and net zero is that they will look, it's either a pressure from their customers or their consumers, of the supply chains and the big firms. And now we're starting to show that they want to monitor how much energy is being used and how much carbon is being used in the supply chain. So they have to report that, and eventually they will have to report that across nationally. So some businesses are getting those challenges from their consumers or from their customers about how do they report it. So that's another driver we can then take.
David, I think Mark makes some interesting points there. First of all, it feels as if the tone and character of the net zero argument being made by government, being made perhaps by academic centres, is being pitched at SMEs in the same way that Industry 4.0 was. In other words, selling the virtuous principle, not the tangible bottom line benefits. And also, SMEs are coming under pressure from their supply chains as well as government.
I think that's absolutely right. Remember, we've been through a profound period of dislocation. We've had COVID, we've had the war in Ukraine disrupting supply chains, we've had the self-inflicted economic cost of Brexit as well, which have really taken up a lot of management bandwidth. They're having to grapple with these longer-term fundamental challenges around net zero and Industry 4.0. And I think simply trying to kind of sell it to manufacturers as a positive thing we need to do isn't going to cut it. They need to understand that this is a fundamental transformation of business and industry that will take place. And unless we do this, I don't think significant chunks of our manufacturing base will survive without a fundamental change. And that requires collaboration between firms and universities, and in particular with government.
I want to pick up on one of the things Mark Swift was saying about supply chain pressures. When I was reporting on the Industry 4.0 adoption story over the last few years, I spoke to a number of big companies about this. One stood out in particular, and it was quite harsh, I thought. They were saying to their supply chain partners all the way down the line, we're heading off on a digital journey. If you don't jump on our bandwagon, you'll no longer work for us anymore. Now, I think we'd all agree that's not going to work when it comes to net zero. One company I talked to, Siemens Digital Industries, takes a much more collegial, holistic approach towards this. And Brian Holliday, the managing director, is also actively concerned at the lack of policy support for smaller businesses.
I think a lot of companies don't know where to turn for the really tangible things, and I think this is where we've got to do better. Some of our institutions are set up well to address productivity, less so on sustainability. And I think some of the policy instruments from government need to improve so that companies are getting a benefit from doing the right things. We reward innovation spend in R&D tax credits and patent box, and companies understand that system. What we're less good at is rewarding investment in sustainability enhancing technology investment as well. So we're a bit clunky when it comes to enhanced capital allowances around sustainability. So I think, yes, there is movement, there's good intent. I'm not sure that marries up yet with companies actually reducing energy consumption at scale, because it's quite hard. But actually, there are a number of partner companies and a number of technologies that can help. And again, I think it's like productivity. It's marrying domain expertise, with a little bit of investment to get going and starting to see the difference. I think in terms of scope one, what's the impact on the planet from our own operations, of course. Scope two, on the indirect side, the carbon generated or emitted, from our sources of energy. But we're really now starting to step up equally on scope three. Yes, it's supply chain, but actually it's also the users of our technology. So when you consider that 1 in 3 machines globally features a Siemens control system, and we've got a particularly prevalent use of our industrial motors and variable speed drives, we see that as a huge responsibility to better convey what can be done through stories, through our domain expertise shared with our supply chain and also our customer base. So no, absolutely, we're looking at that. This is the massive opportunity, well beyond what we generate in our own factories, because of the sheer amount of outsourced or subcontracted work that goes on for us as a manufacturer to get our product to market.
So David, we've been discussing 2 challenges now being thrown at manufacturers. There's 4.0, Industry 4.0, digital manufacturing tools, if you like, and of course now net zero. But the fact of the matter is, you're unlikely to have a successful net zero if you do not equip your manufacturing operations with digital technology.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. So we've got these twin transitions, and it's about how they are handled, I think, holistically. So I think the companies that are best placed to actually manage these are those that are engaging in continual innovation anyway. They're constantly trying to improve their processes and boost efficiency. And then, in the process of doing that, increasingly bringing in this net zero ambition, because that is also helping to drive down costs in terms of reducing carbon emissions. So, in the future, we're increasingly going to have to account for the carbon that we use, and we'll have to pay for it in some way. That could be through, our own emissions trading system, possible carbon border adjustment mechanisms coming into play. But in terms of the strategic mix going forwards, reducing carbon is going to have to be part of that drive to improve efficiency.
I suppose it all boils down to the old adage that you can't manage what you can't measure. I discussed this with Professor Steve Evans at the Institute for Manufacturing at Cambridge University while we were together at the UK Manufacturing Forum last year, organised by the High Value Manufacturing Catapult and by the Institute for Manufacturing. The key, he said, is about getting your horses and carts in the right order.
We've always lived with the mantra, why automate an inefficient process? In fact, you shouldn't. You should make the process efficient, then you should buy the kit. And one of the reasons isn't that you're automating inefficiency, it's that the act of making that process efficient means that you better understand the process, and then you automate it in a better way. That's also true for sustainability. So my advice is, for anybody listening, look at sustainability practice and what that can do for you before buying expensive sustainability technology, because then you'll know that any of your investments are actually the right ones.
So I suppose it's fair to say that if you actually just focus on getting your manufacturing design, process, and everything product correct, then actually sustainability should flow from that anyway.
So for manufacturers, the largest part of our sustainability impacts, the negative impacts, come from the energy that we use to make things and the energy and the polluting processes that went into the materials that we buy, that we bring into our factories, that we assemble and integrate into wonderful products. And those are all things that cost money. So if we reduce them rather than substitute, if we reduce the amount of material we're using to make our end product, if we reduce the energy we use in our factory, we're hitting our sustainability goals while saving money. And that's the first step. Every time, let's do it in a way that saves us money, because the journey does get expensive. But what we don't want is a first step to be an expensive step. The first step should be putting money in your pocket and putting knowledge into your brain. And then we'll use that better knowledge and the money to invest in much better technological solutions, because that's when we'll need them.
I thought that was really interesting. Let's just stand back a minute. If you go back to what we learned from the global financial crisis, essentially we have a banking system that is not very good at mobilising resources and investing it in productive uses in this country. That leaves us less resilient as an economy going forwards. Now, it's all very well saying that, yes, if we start moving towards net zero, there will be savings for companies. That will indeed be the case. But there's also going to have to be substantial investment in new technologies going forwards. Hence that point that he made there. This is going to start to get expensive. And we need to think about where that investment will come from. It will come from shareholders, from banks, from investors, but the government also has to play a role here. I think one of the things that has struck me recently, partly because of all the debates about gigafactories and other things, is that with Brexit, the UK has effectively cut itself off from the European Investment Bank, which has been investing very heavily in the net zero journey. Now, we have something called the UK Infrastructure Bank, but it's still fledgling and it isn't really yet scaled up. So we need to think about how we get investment into net zero in order to help manufacturing.
Well, what Steve Evans was saying there is a perfect segue into talking about materials, about the steel industry, and about those difficult policy decisions that will impact how manufacturers adapt to this journey. Let's start with Paul Cantwell from the National Manufacturing Institute Scotland. His vision of the future is arguably quite radical.
I think it's very key to drive incentivisation within industry to demonstrate that we're serious about this, to allow us to create a fair trading base, because as we move towards kind of net zero trading, because that's what we're talking about, is fair trade for low carbon products and services, it's key to ensure that the appropriate infrastructure and kind of taxation is implemented to allow companies to operate on an even keel in a community. And I do believe that a carbon tax levy will help to drive change within industry rather than moving to where is it most cheaply manufactured, but it could be potentially the most polluting means of manufacture, to right, we understand the costs associated to a more sustainable product or service or supply chain, but we buy into that due to the reward we might receive as being first movers in that area. But as we move to a lower carbon footprint or a green shore and a low carbon manufacturing base, there may be larger initial investments to enable that, and industry themselves can't do it. So it does require government intervention to enable these larger investments in infrastructure change. But then there's a recognition of that in a basis of we're making it more sustainable, it has lower environmental impact, and therefore there should be a bit of reward or recognition for that. And I believe that will be driven by legislation. I hope that will also be driven by a carbon tax. Another example, if a product was to consume a remanufactured product rather than a virgin product, then there should be a recognition for that company to have a bit of a carbon tax break, or recognizing what the carbon footprint offset of accepting that product into their service or their operation was. So this is a journey, and what we're finding is it's important to understand your baseline. It's important to work with the catapults to understand how your products are designed, how your designs of your products cast a long shadow, not only in the economics of how much it costs you to make, but also in the embedded carbon footprint or greenhouse gas emissions associated to that product. And then we're working with companies on kind of what we call cost prevention, energy recovery, energy saving technologies and processes that exist to try to drive down your operational costs or manage them more effectively, particularly as we're in an energy crisis at the moment, but also understand where do you need to make that future investment? How are you helping your organization become more sustainable and create that local content? And what we're also finding is those global organizations are looking for more local content, secure of supply and consistency in supply. So we're beginning to also understand where their needs and their drivers are to try to encourage more localization of supply chain content too, to de-risk their deliveries and de-risk their carbon footprint. It's also worth noting that for most products, approximately 70% of the total embodied emissions is actually in the material itself. So we've really got to recognize that and start driving behavior of accepting kind of circular materials or reprocessed materials rather than virgin materials into our manufacturing community and value chains. And what we see is small to medium-sized enterprises are going to be part of the solution because they're more agile, they're more dynamic, and it's just working with them to recognize that as we're in a current energy crisis, by adopting more sustainable approaches, that does drive down your operational costs, or it enables you to recover energy, recover material value, and reduce waste that inevitably improves the bottom line of a business.
I think he made a lot of interesting points there. And I guess there's two points I want to make in response to that. One, this whole idea of green shoring I think is fascinating. With part of my project at the moment is looking at possibilities for reshoring, i.e. bringing manufacturing closer to home, as it were. And we've often talked about things like food miles in how we consume food. I want to talk more about manufacturing miles going forwards and how we can build a more resilient, localized and greener supply chain going forward. So certainly I think there's a lot of mileage in that, but there would need to be an industrial policy to support it. In terms of reusing and recycling, I think we really have to talk about the circular economy. Some sectors really have embraced that in a big way, as we heard there. There's a lot further to go, but there's lots of optimism. So, for example, I've often visited several companies which think about, for example, the embedded carbon in cars. And the scope there is to actually retrofit, particularly classic cars, with an electrified drivetrain. I think there's going to be a big market there in the future going forwards, and lots of really interesting startups that are beginning on that journey. We need to think about that much more broadly.
David, as you said, the big question is where does government fit into all this? I mean, they've mandated the targets, but are they ready to invest in making them a reality? Let's hear more from Paul Cantwell.
We're looking for much faster returns and movements within industry. There is a target of 2035 to decarbonise the manufacturing supply chain base, and we're looking to drive those informed decisions on what that needs to be to ensure that we do not offshore our supply chain, because it's easy to hit a target by offshoring it and allowing someone else to pick up the greenhouse gas emission footprint or bucket. What we need to do is we need to ensure that we're providing sufficient support for industry to transition to this state, understand what they can do on an individual basis, but also work with us to understand how we can then lobby government on what needs to happen on a national level, because it's too big a problem for a company, a sector, or a group of companies in an area can work with. And we believe that there's early wins and early adoptions that we can point to and demonstrate. We're aware that the combustion engine is being phased out, but within that supply chain base, we've got a brilliant value chain on remanufacturing combustion engines, gearboxes. They're looking for a new challenge. So why aren't we working to map that capability and transition it to other areas such as wind turbine management or other applications? You could argue the scale. You could argue the risk portfolio, but there's still a fundamental capability of them being able to do that for one industry, and I'm sure given a chance they can do it for another.
Interesting points there, and I think that on a number of levels, if we think about the new technologies that are coming, whether it's Industry 4.0 or some of these green technologies, how those technologies are used in sectors will vary from place to place. And I think there's a big role here for devolution. It's interesting that story was from Scotland, where they're doing a lot of work in terms of trying to achieve net zero. And I think we need to see much more devolution to regions across the UK to enable more localised kind of industrial policies to be developed to actually do this sort of work. And I think one illustration of that, which we heard from there as well, was about how we can take existing capabilities and skills and then diversify them. I mean, we've done that for a long time in the UK. If you think back to the collapse of MG Rover, the then Regional Development Agency worked with the supply chain to shift it into premium automotive, into aerospace, into medical technologies, saving tens of thousands of jobs. We need to be making a similar effort now as we go to net zero, if we're to think about this in terms of a just transition, whereby we're helping companies and workers make a transition into new skills and new applications.
Which brings us on to the steel industry, perhaps one of the most perennially troubled sectors in UK manufacturing. It's a situation that is very often down to factors beyond their control, as we'll see. I discussed the steel industry's net zero prospects with Chris MacDonald. He's the chief exec at the Materials Processing Institute. He largely echoes what Paul Cantwell was saying about the need for government to take a proactive role.
So to make new steel, recycling old steel is something that we've done for a long time, and it's also sort of kind of beguiling in the UK to think that this would solve all of our problems as well, because we export about 10 million tonnes of scrap steel overseas for reprocessing every year, but we only make about 7 million tonnes of new steel in the UK. So from a numbers basis, it looks like we could do that. But there are a couple of challenges. So one is that the steel that we make, it has certain quality requirements that rules out some of the recycled steel. And also as a producer as well, it's important to have some flexibility around raw materials. So that's why I think whilst there is a big opportunity for us to recycle more steel in the UK, we will still need some primary steel production as well. So we can do the recycling, but we also have to find a way to make zero carbon or green steel from iron ore too. The UK is currently quite a challenge. We're seeing major investment in new electric arc furnace and green steel technology throughout the world, particularly in Europe. A lot of our European competitors, new green steel plants with electric arc furnaces have been announced in Sweden and in Finland just in the last week. There's investment in Germany, in France, in Italy. You know, I could go on. And we're not seeing that investment in the UK. So what we have to think about is what uniquely is blocking this investment in the UK. And fundamentally, the business case isn't there. So we've got a big problem with energy prices. So UK steel producers are paying 40 to 60% more for energy than our near neighbours in Europe. And so, you know, if you're sat in the boardroom of a multinational steel business and deciding where to invest, there is always somewhere better than the UK. And I think this is a real problem for us because the whole steel industry globally is transforming. It's becoming a green steel sector. And if the UK doesn't capture some of that investment, then the only other option is that we lose our steel industry altogether. And so we enter into a sort of unique experiment where we become the only modern economy in the world without a steel industry. And do we really want to do that? So I think fundamentally we've got to address what is the problem with the business environment that makes the UK competitive. And then the second thing we need to look at is co-investment with government. So where investment is happening, it's happening with industry and government investing together. And government's generally investing about 50% of the capital cost. And again, we're in an international competitive race for investment here. And so to attract that investment in the UK, we will need government investment alongside private sector investment.
We should point out that that interview was recorded before the recent announcement that the government is thinking of investing several £100 million in British Steel in Scunthorpe for an electric arc furnace. David, that investment is something, but from the sound of what Chris just said, it doesn't really touch the sides, does it?
No, not at all. I mean, it's a start, which is what we wanted from the UK government in recognising that transforming the steel industry is going to require significant resources. But much more will be needed. It'll have to come from the companies themselves, from the government, but also we need some sort of vehicle like a UK infrastructure bank to actually invest in these new green technologies going forwards. And we have to do that. I mean, one of the things that really struck me in what we just heard then was this idea of, you know, a unique experiment where we don't have a steel industry. That set alarm bells off in my head. You know, I see steel as fundamentally a foundational industry which underpins a lot of other manufacturing. And if we let it go, that will push up costs for manufacturers across a range of industries, including the car industry, but also in construction. So given its strategic importance, I think we have to find a way to support it and really invest in new technologies to reduce the carbon use in the industry.
Well, I mentioned a little earlier that the steel industry is not entirely the architect of its own misfortunes. Chris McDonald's very clear that it's fighting with maybe one and a half arms tied behind its back.
I am often heard complaining that we don't have an industrial strategy in the UK, but we don't have an energy strategy either. And fundamentally, this is the first thing we need to sort out. And actually, the challenge there is really great. So I estimate that in order to green the UK steel industry, we would need to increase our energy generation by about 10%. If we add on electric vehicles, that's possibly another 20 to 25%. We currently import up to 30% of our electricity via interconnectors, which is a big problem for the UK as well, actually, in many ways. And so, we could be looking at sort of 50, 60% increase in UK electricity generation required. That needs to be green and it needs to be internationally competitive at cost as well. And that's fundamentally a challenge of public policy. And that's the first challenge that needs to be addressed if we're going to be successful in transforming not only our steel sector, but our whole economy to becoming a green economy too.
David, I suppose it's fair to say that unless the UK deals with its energy market and indeed with the national grid, which is said to be in urgent need of an upgrade in order to cope with new energy demands and new energy sources, manufacturing as a whole is going to find life difficult, no matter how well each manufacturer in turn deals with its net zero journey.
I think that's absolutely right. There's going to have to be a real improvement in terms of the capacity of the grid to deliver essentially green electricity to households and also companies. We've got to further decarbonise the energy sector, but also we've got to look at how we can make that affordable for companies. We've already got energy prices substantially higher than in the continent for a number of reasons. The way the energy system works here and the kind of, I think, failed privatisation experiment that we've seen with the energy market, the lack of reserve capacity in some cases. So we have to think again about how we decarbonise energy and keep it affordable for companies so that we can then in turn help decarbonise the manufacturing base.
Some sobering thoughts from David Bailey there. And that brings us to the end of this report. David in Birmingham, thank you so much for being with us.
Really interesting stories from manufacturers and great to be involved today. Thank you for having me here.
Something Kirsty Davies-Chinook said to me during the course of our chat really resonated. She was saying how manufacturers just tend to get on with things in a spirit of optimism without much fanfare. And I suspect the same is going to happen with net zero. And I hope it happens to you as well, because we've heard a lot about structural challenges that may impact our national strategy towards achieving net zero, possibly for the negative, but I hope that doesn't affect the way you pursue your own particular journey, because as we've heard, there's a great deal of self-interest, a great deal to be gained from decarbonising your business. Now, if you want to ask some more questions about this, talk to a panel of experts headed by Sam Turner, who's the Net Zero Ambassador for the High Value Manufacturing Catapult. We've got a panel discussion on February the 6th at 5 p.m. Do join us. Just look out on social media for links and so on. And of course, if you're watching this after February the 6th and you want to see what happened during that panel discussion, that debate, just go to the Manufacturing TV website and click on Manufacturing Debates. All will be made clear there. So that's it from us, from me and from David Bailey. Thank you for watching. Goodbye for now.